The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass.
Hello and welcome to What Catholics Believe. I'm your host, Thomas Nagley, and with me tonight is Father William Jenkins. He is a priest member of the Society of St. Pius V. He's also the pastor of Immaculate Conception Church right here in Norwood, Ohio. Hello, Father. How are you tonight?
Much better, thank you, Tom. And yourself?
Doing well, Father. Thanks for being here.
I'm glad to hear it.
Father, I have been diligently working through the email inbox over the last couple of weeks. We had accumulated quite the stash of emails in our email account. I believe it was well over 200 emails we had in there, but we've slowly been working through those together, and we are now down to somewhere around 60 emails left in our inbox. So
let's take care of those tonight then.
All 60 of them. Here we go.
Ideal.
But no, I thought we could get through at least some of them tonight, Father. And I'd like to start with one that references a recent program where we talked about an email we received from a kind of a conservative-minded Novus Ordo woman who was commenting on your traditional Catholics in the indult Mass video, and she was saying how she preferred to remain in the Novus Ordo and try and effect good changes in the Novus Ordo and lead the Novus Ordo back to the traditional ways. And this email that we received from a viewer says that he had a very similar experience. He was a conservative-minded Novus Ordoite, and his story here, I thought it was fascinating to read through this, Father. He says that I was attending a local diocesan, quote, traditional, extraordinary form of the Mass. I also had very similar hopes and aspirations that we could be a force for change from within by example. However, it had more and more over the years occurred to me that whereas I have but a short time to live and worship and be an example to my children, the liberals who usurp the Catholic Church hierarchy have centuries to ultimately push their agenda over many generations. They get to play the long game, and they know it. Every generation who attends any Mass at these liberal Novus Ordo parishes, extraordinary form, indult, or new Novus Ordo Mass, will inevitably become somewhat more open to the liberal changes as a natural consequence of a slow breaking down of resistances over long periods of time. If you show up at all to these Novus Ordo parishes, you risk being poisoned by the general environment, and every generation going forward will inevitably be a little more malleable to the liberalism than the one before. The final straw for me that made me see this with crystal clarity was not too long ago while attending a, quote, traditional Latin Mass at a diocesan church. The priest during the sermon first mentioned the wonderful spirit of Vatican II in a very positive sense, and then he had the audacity to quote the words of Pope Francis. With that, I got up and left and have not been back since. The simple reality that any true Catholic desiring to change the Novus Ordo Church from within needs to really understand is that it is much more likely you and your family will be the ones changed over the long term of exposure to liberal poison that you will inevitably be exposed to while attending any of the Novus Ordo parishes. And people should not kid themselves. That is the only reason why the, quote, traditional Mass is even offered at all at this point by the Vatican II cult. Thank you for all you do, and God bless. Father, what's your take on that email? It seems to me to be
I agree.
It's
well said.
Yeah.
From his own experience, he saw that the tendency, of course, is to be liberalized and modernized, to be influenced by them. Because to attend there, one has to make continual compromises to begin with. Mm-hmm. And to make compromise the standard operating procedure of your life, your faith, the practice of your religion, is deadly, especially with modernism. Especially with the modernists. And so I agree totally with what he's saying. And he said, well, my point, actually, in some ways he expressed it better than I did, that you cannot remain within the Novus Ordo and practice the traditional faith and expect all to be well. Mm-hmm. Because the Novus Ordo is the antithesis of the traditional Catholic faith, because the Novus Ordo is based upon modernism. And as St. Pius X said, modernism is the synthesis of all heresies. And it doesn't mean that anyone who imbibes principles of modernism immediately becomes an apostate, but over time, the faith is eroded and ultimately destroyed.
And I thought it was a great point to make how the liberals, they're in this for the long run, and they're perfectly willing to, kind of draw this out and do whatever it takes, even if it's generations or centuries. They're willing to put in work.
He's expressing that in a good way. The permanent instruction of the ultimate detail of the Masons,
Right.
which was found in the Masonic lodges in northern Italy, okay, and was actually published at the order of Pope Pius IX, and again by Pope Leo XIII. It has the Masons laying out a plan for what they want is the infiltration of the church. And the writer of that instruction to his Masonic followers, he uses the name Nubius as his nom de guerre, or nom de plume, if you want to call it. Either way, that's his code name. And this man is saying it will not be the work of a generation. It will go on for generation after generation after generation. Our work of infiltrating the church is something that is going to take a long time. We have to work at this very carefully, slowly, and cautiously, so we don't trip any alarms. And so what this gentleman is saying is exactly the same thing. He recognized the liberal, modernist, progressivist, leftist, whatever you want to call it, they're all bedfellows. Their plan is the long term. As Satan's plan. Satan's plan is the short term for each individual soul, but for the church, which is immortal, he has a long-term plan. And this is what they're about right now, is fulfilling that long-term plan. So he warns those who would be unwittingly part of that plan of the danger that they're in.
Mm-hmm. All right, another email, Father, along similar lines here. It's from a viewer who says, directly after listening to your show on the Indult Mass, I had the chance to speak with a family member who now attends an Indult or sometimes the SSPX Mass. He believes that the pontificate of Francis has caused a backlash within the Catholic community so powerful that it will bring about the renewal of the faith as it once was. He says the new rites of ordination in the Novus Ordo Mass is valid but harmful, and that people will just walk away from it and the church will be restored. He feels that the modernists are dying out and that within 50 years it will all be back to normal because the youth recognize the true faith. He also criticized my use of the term indult as antiquated and incorrect. It's just the Mass, he said. Please give me your thoughts on this theory and what, if anything, can be said in response to this.
Well, if anything, his terminology is faulty because it's not referred to as the Mass by the Novus Ordo. It's called the extraordinary form, as though it's something exceptional, not the rule, but the exception. That's what they've labeled the 1962 Latin liturgy. So he's got to face that fact that the liturgy that he attends in the Novus Ordo is called the extraordinary form by way of the fact that it is not their norm. It's not their normal standard form of worship. It's permitted only as a privilege now. But I think he's living in Fantasyland. I really do think he's imagining that this is going to turn out well. I agree that there is a certain backlash against Francis. I do agree with that because he's so egregious in his denials and his attacks on the traditional Catholic faith. There's no doubt about that. The fact that there's this large tidal wave of souls now who are turning away from the Novus Ordo and want to come streaming back to the traditional faith and the traditional Catholic religion. Well, I see there's an increase in the number of people who are attending the traditional masses. The Society of St. Pius V, I imagine if you talked to the clergy of the Fraternity of St. Peter and the Society of St. Pius X, they would tell you the same thing. I imagine they would say, yes, Francis is driving so many people away from the Novus Ordo that they are making their way back. Many of them are making their way back to the traditional Catholic pews. But I'm afraid that whole effort is being thwarted by people like this Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, who actually raised the question of whether or not God would allow a pope to be a heretic and still be the pope. And his answer is yes. Contrary to what St. Francis de Sales says, I imagine, contrary to what other great Catholics, St. Robert Bellarmine has said, he insists, no, that can be. We can have a pope who's a heretic and still be the pope. Well, what that comes down to is a question of, does the pope have to be a Catholic?
Yes.
Does the pope have to be a Catholic? And he says, well, really, no. The Pope doesn't have to be a Catholic. Now, this is the ultimate expression of ecumenism. Yeah. And here he is, a would-be traditional, quote-unquote, Catholic, right? But he's so desperately trying to somehow salvage a papacy for Francis beyond doubt. That Francis is the Pope, the whole Pope, and nothing but the Pope, and you can't dare question that he is the Pope. That he's coming to these conclusions, which are actually modernist and Novus Ordo. That no, you don't have to be a Catholic to be a Pope. I mean, he might as well just go out and say, you could be a Lutheran and be a Pope, a Lutheran in faith and be the Pope. You could, in a sense, I mean, you take it to his reasoning to its conclusions, you could even be a Muslim and be the Pope. You don't have to have the Catholic faith to be a Pope. Now, you and I know that you and I have to have the Catholic faith to be Catholics, right? That's the Church who tells us that. We have to have the Catholic faith to be Catholics. And if we were espousing heresy, that we would not be Catholics, we'd be denounced as not being Catholics, and even before being publicly announced, we would be turned away, because of our heresy and the public scandal we were given. But with Francis, it doesn't hold. That doesn't apply to him. Why? Because, as Peter Kwasniewski would say, well, he's the Pope. So he doesn't really have to have the Catholic faith to be Pope. Kwasniewski might say, well, he has to have the Catholic faith to be Catholic, but he doesn't have to have the Catholic faith. He doesn't have to be a Catholic to be Pope, though. The only thing that would make him not Pope is if, even though he might personally deny the faith, as long as he doesn't try to proclaim heresy ex cathedra, he doesn't really have to believe anything. If you take him at his word, you might say, well, he doesn't have to believe in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. He doesn't have to believe even in the Incarnation. He doesn't even have to believe in God. As long as he doesn't try to ex cathedra pronounce that as a doctrine of faith, he's still the Pope. I mean, I imagine, I don't know. I mean, if I asked Peter Kwasniewski, well, would he still be a Catholic? I don't know what he'd say. He might say, well, no, he wouldn't be a Catholic if he denied these things. He'd say, okay, but you're saying he'd still be the Pope. Well, as long as he doesn't try to proclaim these things ex cathedra, he would still be the Pope. You see the nonsense they're getting to here. And I'm afraid what the gentleman is saying in his letter, he's overlooking the errors that are coming in from those. The modernist errors that these would-be conservative Novus Ordo Catholics have to resort to in order to justify the dilemma they're setting up for everything. But yes, he's a heretic. No, he doesn't have the faith. Yes, he's still the Pope, and we have to regard him as the Pope and respect him as the Pope. As long as he doesn't try to pronounce the heresies ex cathedra, there is inevitably that's going to lead them some serious errors against the faith. And what I'm afraid of is those who are reacting to Francis are not necessarily being driven back to practice the traditional Catholic religion and embracing the traditional Catholic faith. I'm afraid those who are being driven away by Francis might wind up in some kind of a tertium quid, like a third thing that is neither Francis and his Novus Ordo, or the actual traditional Catholic faith, and the practice of the traditional Catholic religion, that they're going to come up with something in the middle, which has elements of both mixed in. So I think this gentleman is making a grave mistake in thinking this is all going to kind of work out because of the reaction against Francis. Mm-hmm. You'd think that those who saw the changes coming in soon after Vatican II would have reacted and returned to the traditional Catholic religion. No. Many people just left the church. Some of them went on to become Mormons or whatever. They just lost faith entirely. And I'm afraid, although he might see young people who are asking questions now, and some of them returning, some of them maybe never even were at the traditional Catholics, attending the traditional Mass, and who maybe they didn't even learn the traditional Catholic catechism in the modernist schools where they went. So maybe some of the people he's seeing are finding the traditional Catholic faith for the first time. But I dare say that for every one of them, there are many who are just losing faith altogether. Either because they're conservative Novus Ordo and they're lost in the maze of the dilemma they faced and set up for themselves between Francis and the traditional teaching of the Church, or they just lose faith altogether in the church, and maybe even our Lord Himself.
And Father,
I mean, we've actually heard from some people who went off and became Muslim over this, just because there's some certitude, at least they think, in what they well. I wish what he was saying were true, but I don't believe it is. I think he's making a grave mistake in thinking that this is the answer.
And Father, doesn't this paint a rather sad portrait of the Catholic Church? I mean, it's, that we're just kind of patiently waiting, hoping that things are going to work out and return back to normal. I mean, isn't the Catholic Church supposed to be indefectible? Isn't it supposed to be the spotless bride of Christ? I mean, is it just being reduced to some kind of just poor, pitiable thing where we're just waiting and hoping that things are going to work out and hopefully maybe someday, 50 years from now, get back to its original glory? Isn't that a rather sad picture of the church?
It does definitely paint the church as being something purely passive and impotent, basically impotent in the face of the attacks of Christ, of the attacks of the Antichrist, the attacks of the organizations that are anti-Christian, the plots of the Masons, for example, and so on. The church cannot defend itself. That Satan has somehow crafted a plan which is so diabolically clever that the church is reduced to being absolutely passive and incapable of responding to this and defending itself. So we're just left to kind of say, oh God, like the apostles in the boat, saying, oh Lord, save us, we perish, when our Lord is in the boat. He's asleep in the boat. And they needed to have faith. But they weren't, here they are giving up, saying, oh Lord, we're going to go down under here unless you wake up to save us, as though He had to wake up to save us. So I think what you're saying is true. The church has been given by our Lord Jesus Christ the necessary means of addressing these issues for the sake of souls. And that's what traditional Catholics are doing, honest to goodness traditional Catholics are doing with that. They're not overstepping their bounds, quite the contrary. Well, some of them are, I must say. But true traditional Catholics are not overstepping their bounds and doing what they're doing, and simply holding on to the traditional faith and continuing to practice the traditional Catholic religion. There are those who would say that we're wrong to do that because we don't have the endorsement of the modernists in the Vatican. But we know that this is not Christ's teaching, that we have to go to modernists to have the approval to practice the traditional Catholic faith. We are entitled to do that by virtue of our Catholic baptism. Not only are we entitled to do it, we are required to do it. And no one can actually contradict that requirement imposed on us by Christ Himself at our baptism. So those who would say, no, all we can do is sit back and wait and let things play out, and see God will give graces where He sees fit, and in the course of time it'll all come back around again. That's not what Christ Himself has told us to do, and that's not what the church in her sacred tradition is taught. And I think that's a very important point, Tom. If we learn from the church's tradition throughout her history, she never says, well, it's all over. Well, let's just all, face it, and we're just absolutely helpless. The church is just totally helpless in this situation. There's nothing we can do, so we need a Deus to come kind of ex machina and tell us all, okay, now, nobody knows what to do, and I'm going to have to come back, and I have to start all over again. That's not what the church did during the Great Western Schism. That's not what the church did during the Babylonian captivity of the church. That there were Catholic faithful who knew what to do by the grace of God, and they did it. And that's exactly what the traditional Catholics are doing right now.
Right. All right, well, Father, next email is from a viewer who says that he is rather new to the church, and he provides us with a quote from the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which says that the unworthiness of the minister does not invalidate the sacrament. And he says, so while clearly a priest must be validly ordained, how are the sacraments of an FSSP or an SSPX priest invalid as long as the essentials are followed? So what would you reply to that, Father?
Well, validity depends on a number of things. The validity of a Mass depends on a number of things. Of course, you have to have the matter and the form of the intention, right? For any sacrament to be valid, right? But a priest needs to be validly ordained. And he would need to be validly ordained by a validly consecrated bishop. Right? So if you have the Novus Ordo rites of ordination and consecration, if there is a doubt about these things, then there's a certain doubt that necessarily applies here about whether there's a valid consecration at a Mass offered by a priest doubtfully ordained by a doubtfully consecrated bishop. Sounds to me that this gentleman just assumes that all of these are being valid. All of these being valid, why would you not go to one of these priests? Well, you don't have the certitude. I mean, the Society of St. Pius X is using priests who were not conditionally ordained. It came from the Novus Ordo, were ordained in the Novus Ordo, and were not conditionally ordained in the traditional Catholic way. So there are problems with that. Well, obviously, for traditional Catholics, there have got to be problems with that. And there are other issues with the Fraternity of St. Peter, the same thing. You know, they might be ordained with the traditional rite. Was the bishop who ordained them, was he ordained or consecrated with the traditional rite? That's another issue, which they might not be interested in. I don't know. But it does raise the red flag there. But let's assume that you have a priest who is certainly ordained, and there's no doubt about it. Okay, let's see, you have a priest who is ordained in the traditional Catholic rite by a traditional Catholic bishop who himself was ordained and consecrated by a traditional Catholic bishop and so on. So you have that succession of holy orders beyond doubt. The validity is beyond doubt. And so why would one not go to his Mass? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas actually, and the Council of Trent after him, did raise the question. The Council of Trent, I think he refers to, right, does say that the unworthiness of the minister doesn't prevent the valid consecration and the validity of the Mass, which the Church has always known. Okay, that's not saying anything new. There were Donatists back in the early days of the Church, like in the time of St. Augustine, who would deny that. But the Church has pretty roundly established once and for all that the unworthiness of the minister does not invalidate the sacrament. So would there be reasons why a Catholic would not go to a Mass of someone validly ordained? Well, yes. For example, the Church has, in the past, recognized the validity of the Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox rite of ordination and the succession of their orders. Nowadays, there's a great mixture here, okay? Nowadays, there's a great mixture between what the Church would have considered valid before and what the Church would have considered invalid before. So with the Protestants and the Orthodox and the mixing of the two, this is a serious problem, okay? And not only that, but, you know, you look at the Orthodox in communist-held lands where the Communist Party has been in control. And, you know, you have agents of the secret police, the communist secret police, in the clergy, okay? And they are there precisely to spy on the people. Look at what's going on in China right now, and you see the agents are becoming bishops and priests of the Chinese church, with Francis's actually backing up the Chinese Communist Party, taking control, naming the bishops, right, and so on, or agents of the Chinese Communist Party. That's what their bishops are now. And Francis is the one who's actually made the arrangements to have this happen. It is said that the lady whose hand she was slapping there was trying to tell him, please, you know, maybe she wasn't accusing him of saying, please don't do this to the Chinese people. But supposedly she was saying, please come to the aid and defense of the Chinese people, the Chinese Catholics. So he furiously began smacking her away from him. Because he is the author of this, this travesty, this tragedy. But anyway, the point is when St. Thomas Aquinas addresses the question himself in the third part, the Pares Tertia of the Summa Theologica. Some refer to as the Summa Theologiae, the summary of all theology. The third part would be question 82, Article 9. He talks about the question of attending the masses of excommunicated priests, masses of let's say, heretical priests, the masses of unworthy priests, let's say, like public sinners. And that's a very interesting article. He does talk about that. And he always starts by giving arguments for the wrong answer first, okay? And the answers he gives there are answers why it's okay to go ahead and attend their Mass. So you know when you start reading this, if his answers initially are, well, yes, it's okay to do that because of this, and yes, it's okay to do that, you know his answer is going to be the negative of whatever they're arguing for, because he says, like, said contra, but his having given the rationale for attending the masses of the various kinds of excommunicated, heretical, unworthy priests, public sinner priests, he then goes on to explain why this is not right. It is not acceptable for a Catholic to do this. It is scandalous, and it actually, in a way, partakes of their own crimes. Okay, but he does say this, though. In the second part of the body, the corpus of his answer, he says, however, and this is very important, however, he says, with regard to the case of, let's say, heretical or an unworthy priest, or minister of the sacrament, or offerer of the Mass, celebrate the Mass, one realizes that although this man may do things that make him subject to divine penalties, until the Church has pronounced a formal, let's say, declaration of his guilt, a Catholic could go to the Mass, because it doesn't have the sense that one is publicly defying the moral law, and one does not have the certitude of the guilt of the individual until the Church has passed sentence. And so, but his point is, once the Church has passed sentence and said, yes, the person is guilty of these crimes, clearly you cannot go near them. You cannot attend their Masses. Until their sentence passed, yes, it can be justifiable to go and attend and receive the sacraments from them. He does make this exception, though, with regard to a priest who is openly guilty of living in concubinage or committing fornication or some other terrible sin of impurity, that because these crimes are so serious, he said, if it is notorious that the priest is actually engaging in these things, that by all means you must stay away from that. Because you can't even give the appearance of endorsing this or any way justifying it. It's a horrendous thing, especially because of the serious obligation of the priest to observe chastity by virtue of his vows. So, St. Thomas takes the hard line on this, he really does. With regard to this question of the Church, let's say, passing sentence and issuing a formal declaration that someone is guilty of, let's say, a crime of heresy or schism or adultery, fornication, whatever it may be. Nowadays, we're in kind of an anomalous situation there, where they have so many immoral priests, and since Vatican II, they've been letting so many priests not only commit, in some cases openly commit, sins of impurity with either gender. I mean, and actually, well, I don't want to go into detail because it's so sordid, but they're notorious for this. The modern Church is notorious for this. The modern bishops are notorious for this. So I'd say the notoriety is there, but also because they've been allowing, since Vatican II, so-called priests such as Hans Küng to openly deny doctrines of the Catholic faith, just openly, flagrantly deny them and mock them. But Francis himself is mocking the traditional teachings of the Church in so many ways that this, again, is something notorious. So I don't think Catholics today need to wait for some declaratory sentence or some pronouncement or some decree from the Vatican because they themselves are guilty of the same crimes and are shielding these things. I mean, we talk about the evil of a bishop shuffling priest abusers around within a diocese, from parish to parish, or even from diocese to diocese, to cover this up. Well, what about the guilt of bishops shuffling heretical priests around who are attacking the faith and attacking not only the faith in the catechism, but attacking the virtue of faith in the souls of the people? And they're shuffling them all around here. I mean, again, the Novus Ordo Church from Vatican II is notorious for doing these things. So if notoriety is the issue, I think the issue is definitely solved, that Catholics should not go to priests who notoriously are involved in these things. And don't wait for some kind of decree from the Chancery Office or from the Vatican.
Father, would you refuse Holy Communion to someone who went to one of these situations that we're talking about, let's say an SSPX or maybe even an FSSP priests who, even if they were certainly validly ordained, would you refuse communion to someone?
The SSPX priest, I would not. Okay. The FSSP, the Fraternity of St. Peter priest, I would, or FSP, whatever it is.
Why?
Because they are formally in union with the Novus Ordo. They are formally part of the Novus Ordo, and they would say so. They openly declare that. That is the raison d'etre of the Fraternity of St. Peter, right? Mm-hmm. They claim, look, we're traditional and we're part of the Novus Ordo, okay? We're within the fold, we're approved, and the Novus Ordo considers us part of them. They don't like it, but here we are, and they have given us approval, somewhat begrudgingly, to say the extraordinary form, right, of liturgy. And for 20 years they tried not to allow it, but they finally gave in, and here we are. You know, they finally let it happen. So here we are, and we're the ones doing it. But they are definitely part of the Novus Ordo, formally part of the Novus Ordo. And they would tell you that yes, the Novus Ordo is Catholic, and yes, it's okay to do that. And yes, it's okay to go to the new Mass, receive the new sacraments, get your marriage annulments, and come back, and we'll give you Holy Communion. They have to go along with all this stuff. The Society of St. Pius X, although they're trying to get this status within the Novus Ordo, they don't have it. And so they are not formally united with Francis and Rome and his entire Novus Ordo thing. In fact, they're still kind of coasting on the will of Archbishop Lefebvre, who created them, the society, who founded the Society of St. Pius X. Not to be the Novus Ordo, right? Although, again, we find what I would consider to be really treasonous plans within the leadership of the Society of St. Pius X against the traditional faith, to try to unite with Rome. I mean, even some of the current Society of St. Pius X priests have even talked about this. There are 100 priests or more who've broken away or been expelled because they objected to it, the cozying up of the SSPX with Rome. And there are priests who are still with the Society of St. Pius X who accused the leadership of the Society of St. Pius X of going soft on Vatican II and kind of losing their way on that. And they haven't yet, they haven't actually come out and said, now this is corrected. They just said there's a problem, and this is where it came from. Nonetheless, I mean, in spite of all that, I would say they have not formally reunited with the Vatican and the modernists. They will say now Francis himself has taken certain initiatives to kind of maybe not get them back under the wing, but maybe a feather, by saying, look, we'll recognize your marriages as being valid. The local bishop has the prerogative of sending one of his diocesan priests to witness the marriage on our behalf. If he doesn't, we'll let you do it, and we'll recognize it as being valid, okay? And the Society of St. Pius X gratefully accepts this. However, it does raise a question, well, what about all the marriages they do without that? What about all the marriages that have been done for all these years without that? What about them? The Society of St. Pius X would say, well, there's no question at all. They're valid marriage. And if you ask them, any one of them, well, if Francis had not given that okay, would that have posed a problem for you? Would you be worried about the validity of your marriage? They say, no, our marriages would be valid anyway. And if he withdrew that permission, we would just continue on doing what we've always done, marrying people on our own authority. And we wouldn't have any qualms about the validity. We haven't received that special benefit of Francis's, feather that he drops, saying, okay, you can sneak under the feather of our wings here, and you can get by with this, and we'll approve the validity of your marriage. And yet, the Society of St. Pius X priests would not tell you that our marriages are invalid, but theirs are because they have Francis's okay. They would never do that. That would undercut all the marriages they've been doing for many, many years now. And they have no doubt that they're valid, with or without Francis's approval. So, in fact, whatever pretensions they're making to the people that, oh, look, we have the approval of the Holy Father in so many ways. Whatever pretensions they're making, oh, look with Francis, when they go to him, look at how faithful and loyal we are. The fact is, this is just a show. It's kind of blowing smoke, in a way, really. But where there's smoke, there's fire, and there's a worry that people have that they will sell out. And it's not out of the question. Mm-hmm. But right now they haven't yet. They're cozying up to them, and I think it's very worrisome, no doubt about it. I think somewhat scandalous, no doubt about it. They offer the masses that they do, saying that they are one in faith with Francis. And I don't believe they are. I consider that to be a bold-faced lie, if they say they are one in faith with Francis. But I don't believe they believe the same things Francis does, and I don't believe that Francis believes the same thing they do. The moment that they say they're one in faith with Francis, and they mean it, is the moment we have to say no, absolutely not. Okay, but even the fact that they're putting that falsehood out there at the altar before consecrating, that's a troubling matter too. That one in faith with Francis business and his local Novus Ordo bishop. Mm-hmm. It's hard to find a way to justify that one way or the other. It's a problem, right? If they are or they aren't, it's a problem. So again, I think the Society of St. Pius X is on very, very shaky and very dangerous ground. But they still formally are not the Novus Ordo. Okay.
Father, why do some sedevacantists use the pre-1955 Holy Week and others the post-1955 version?
Well, see, I don't know that any so-called sedevacantists use the so-called restored rite of Holy Week after 1955. And, maybe the writer can give examples of that. Because all of the so-called sedevacantists, and that's a wide range, that's a broad brush applying to people of many different ideas about the papacy these days. But I don't know any of those who would consider themselves sedevacantists who would be using the reformed or restored so-called rite of Holy Week from 1955 onward. All of those who are that, shall I say, I want to say hardline traditional, I don't know how else to put it that way, used the old rite of Holy Week, pre-1955. Okay.
All right, then next...
That I know of, anyway.
Next question, Father, deals with the words of the original Saint Michael the Archangel prayer, mm-hmm. and the interpretation of that. The passage that the viewer questions is a line that says, "In the holy place itself, where has been set up the see of the most holy Peter in the chair of truth for the light of the world, they have raised the throne of their abominable impiety, with the iniquitous design that when the pastor has been struck, the sheep may be scattered." So he asked, Father, what do they mean when this prayer says they have raised the throne of their abominable impiety? Does that mean that...
Is this one of our emails? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so they're asking, since it says they have raised their throne mm-hmm. of abominable impiety. Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that throne of abominable impiety was already set up?
In 1988 or whenever that
18,
prayer...
18,
yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
In the 1880s, when Pope Leo XIII had the vision, the locution,
yeah.
Whether it was already an accomplished fact, mm-hmm. Well, one has to go back to the historical context here. Remember, Pope Leo XIII was writing this prayer, composed this prayer in the 1880s.
Yes.
Okay? Vatican I, the council, had just taken place 10 years before, or so, right? And it was during that council, 1869 and 1870, that the Freemasonic mercenary legions of Garibaldi, the Mason Garibaldi, invaded Rome, right? Forcibly dispersed the council, Vatican I. Vatican I was never ended. There was no formal end to the First Vatican Council because it was dispersed as the Masonic armies were approaching Rome to lay siege to Rome and to take Rome, which they succeeded in doing, in fact. And that's where the Pope became, from that point, a prisoner of the Vatican. The Vatican was the holdout where the Pope had security. He was surrounded by Rome, which was, up to that, the Masonic takeover of Rome, was actually the kingdom of the Pope. The Pope was actually the king of that country. So what the Masonic legions were doing was they were taking away the marches and the entirety of the Papal States and leaving the Pope basically holed up in the castle, in the keep, basically, the Vatican. That's essentially what it was. It was like the castle and the keep, and the enemy had completely engulfed his entire kingdom, but he had not taken that. And so the Pope became a prisoner in that. And he was a prisoner there from 1870 until 1929 with the Lateran Treaty of Pius XI, right? Gaspari, Mussolini, right? And that is when the Italian state, as it were, paid for the land, the kingdom that they had taken, that the Masons had taken from the Pope. And through Gaspari, the Secretary of State, Pope Pius XI agreed to that. Okay, so there was a formal agreement leaving the Pope as a kingdom, the Vatican City, and basically the patriarchal basilicas and certain other holy sites around the city, right? To this day, when one enters Vatican City, one is leaving Italy and entering a sovereign state, the Vatican. Okay, to this day, as a result of that Lateran Treaty of 1929. When that prayer was written in the 1980s, you're talking about a decade after the Freemasons had taken Rome away. Pope Leo XIII is talking about Rome. He's talking about they've set up the throne of their abominable impiety. It was past tense because they had taken the city of Rome. And that was the See of Peter. Rome was the city of Peter. Vatican City is not the See of Peter. Rome, the city of Rome, is actually the See of Peter. That is the seat of his diocese. And so in taking Rome, in seizing the residence of the Pope, the Quirinale, in seizing the Lateran, St. John Lateran and so on, they had set up the government of their Masonic conspiracy right there in Rome. And that's what he's saying, that they had succeeded in doing. He's not saying, though, what evidently our author is interpreting, that they had already succeeded in setting up the power of the Masons in the Holy See itself and taking control of the papacy. They still had not succeeded in taking control of the papacy. That was their initial intent, but they didn't succeed in 1869 and 1870 because the Pope still remained at large and out of their control.
Would you say they have succeeded now?
I would say they definitely have succeeded now. There's no doubt about it. They have definitely succeeded in their plans to have secure the election of someone who thinks exactly as they do and who honors their wishes and fulfills their wishes with regard to the church, carrying out their plan, whether consciously or unconsciously, deliberately or not deliberately, it doesn't matter. Remember, when when Nubius wrote the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, he said, we need to secure a pope according to our designs, but make sure he's not part of our plans, because he could expose the plan at any moment and ruin everything. So we need to secure a pope, even a pope, but just a pope who thinks like we do. And we need to prepare a generation. We have to, he says it's the work of generations, to prepare generation after generation, to prepare a generation which will produce a man who could become such a pope, who will have to work their way through the seminaries and work their way through the parishes and so on, work their way up in the church to get to the point where they would be elected and chosen. Remember Belladad, the female attorney from Italy, who apostatized from the Catholic Church, became a communist agent here in this country, working with the labor unions as an attorney. This is back in the 20s and 30s. Belladad converted back to her faith, largely through the influence of Bishop Sheen, actually, rejecting communism. But she also saw the contradictions in communism, that they were liars, that they did not care about the common working man at all. All they cared about was the Communist Party, and its power. And so she converted back to the Catholic faith, and she exposed the workings of the communists in this country and around the world. She testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities that she was involved in the recruiting of 1,100 men to enter the Catholic seminaries and become priests as agents of the Kremlin, agents of the Communist Party, USSR. She said that. She testified that under oath before the House Committee on American Activities here in the United States of America. 1,100 that she was aware of, you know. That's one person, okay, who could bring that testimony. So, yes, I do believe they have definitely succeeded in their plan to secure a pope according to their designs, who would deceive the Catholic people worldwide. What did Nubius say there? He said, they will think that they're marching in procession behind the cross and the banner and the tiara, leading them, that it's a Catholic. But he says, in fact, it will be our revolution. They will be following us. And he said, if we secure a pope according to our wishes, it will take only the movement of a little finger of that pope to set on fire the four corners of the world with revolution. This is the revolution en permanence, as he says, the permanent, ongoing revolution. It is the suborning of the Catholic Church. And this is what Nubius said. So you see what has happened now, after Vatican II, during Vatican II and its aftermath, and now we have this Francis, and I think this is exactly what's playing out right now. There's a book that appeared not long ago by a man named Taylor Marshall called Infiltration, and it's drawn a lot of attention, a lot of fire, a lot of information. But these are things we've been pointing out to people for decades now, that he has just put together and put before people, and now they're discovering that, my goodness, infiltration, the church has been infiltrated, as though this is some new novel idea. But the ideal was actually not only floated, it was mapped out by the head of the Freemasons in Italy back in the early 1800s, over 200 years ago. So at least some of the information is getting out there. I mean, for the merits or demerits of the book, I don't know. Some dear soul just sent me a copy of it today. I just received a copy, my first copy of the book today. But again, it appears simply to be bringing up things that we've been saying for many years now about what's happening to the church. Okay. The fact that more and more people are being informed about it, that's good. Okay, but once they're informed about it, they have to decide what to do about it. And that's the question now that remains hanging in the balance. What will they do about that? Will they return to accepting the traditional Catholic faith and practicing it with the traditional Catholic religion and refuse modernism and refuse the Masons and their modernistic plans? Let us hope and pray that they do. I mean, this is ultimately entirely about the love of God for us and our love for him. It's entirely about that, right? That's the bottom line of it all, right? It's a matter of being faithful. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, or what it said. So the decisions that we make now, I mean, the information itself is not enough. There has to be a love for God to respond to that. to rise up about that and say, I will do the will of God in this. And I see now clearly the will of God is the traditional Catholic faith and the traditional Catholic religion. This is what Christ established, and I will be faithful to unto death. This is the response that we have to hope from people. For that, we have to pray that they have the graces necessary to make that decision.
Mm-hmm. Well, Father, let's end with that. We got through a lot tonight. There's still a lot left on our plate, but perhaps we can...
Down to 55?
Something like that, yeah. So
okay.
There is still hope.
Okay.
We can get through them. So we'll continue to work on that. But
right.
Father, just real quick before we close tonight, I just wanted to remind our viewers about our website, wcbohio.com. Mm-hmm. We've put a lot of effort into that website. There's a lot of great material on there. A lot of your writings have been posted on there. The writings that you put in the bulletin every week here at Immaculate Conception, those are posted on the website as they come out. So there's quite a collection of those on there now. Also, every day on the website we post the readings of the Mass of the day, and also the Saint of the Day taken from Father Butler's Lives of the Saints. And these are very, very Catholic practices to read the Saint of the Day, and also the Mass readings. I think that's something great that someone can do every day. Especially, we get so many viewers who don't have access to a traditional Mass, and I think that's one great.
We're looking to live stream the Mass.
Exactly. Yeah. We're getting very close to that.
And Father Alban Butler's. We're not talking about the revised. We're talking about the traditional.
Yes.
The revised is by Atwater. That's modernized.
Right.
The traditional,
yes.
Alban Butler's Lives of the Saints. It's very good to have that.
Yeah, and all of our What Catholics Believe videos are posted on there as they come out. We also have all of the sermons, not only from here in Cincinnati, but also many sermons from Cleveland and Florida, and even a lot of Father Skierke's sermons from Montana.
And might I suggest that our viewers, when they see these sermons, should pass them on. I mean,
yes,
they
definitely.
should post them to their friends, to their email connections and so on, and get them out there, because, you just never know what someone might see that might ring a chord with them and make a difference. So please don't just sit on them and say, oh, okay, well, that was kind of interesting, and then go your way. You should be a kind of an apostle in your own right and pass these things on. By the way, in connection with this also, Tom, I want to take the opportunity to thank our viewers for their help with the Christmas appeal.
Yes.
Here at Immaculate Conception, we have the church and the school and the Rosary procession, which we just had through downtown Cincinnati, and so many other programs that have a wide reach for the traditional Catholic faithful. And so when we have a Christmas appeal that is the single greatest fundraiser we have, we really depend upon that. And a number of our What Catholics Believe viewers have supported us in that. It's very, very much appreciated.
Yes, definitely. Well, Father, thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for everything you do. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Tom. Thank you very much, too.
No problem.
God bless you all.
Yep. Thanks to all of our viewers for watching this episode of What Catholics Believe. Until next time, we ask that you all remember the words of Our Lady at Fatima, to consecrate yourselves and your families to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and to pray and do penance. Thank you, and God bless you.